Before I read from my remarks, I'd like to make a point that I get the impression from what some members of the other political party, but more often from editorials and from think tanks, believing and wanting the public to believe that there's actually a tax bill produced by the tax writing committees of the Congress, and something that is very definitive in what it does to tax policy. And I want to make clear that there is no such document, that all we have so far is what's called a framework agreed to by the leaders of the two tax writing committees and the Treasury Department and the leaders of the House and the Senate. And you cannot draw conclusions about who's going to pay what taxes just from the framework. The other thing I would like to make clear is, and I'll get into real detail on this, is the fact that there are a lot of people drawing conclusions about who's going to get tax benefits and who's going to be hurt as a result of all this information that's out there that nobody can draw conclusions because there isn't any bill before the Congress at this point. There will be in a matter of weeks. The budget that we're debating this week paves the way for fundamental tax reform. For more than a decade, both sides of the aisle have talked about the need for tax reform that provides tax simplification, tax fairness, and gives us the ability to increase our economic competitiveness so that we can grow the economy. Under President George W. Bush, we had the bipartisan tax reform panel. Under President Obama, we had the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission. We've had individual members also authoring tax plans, including a bipartisan bill authored by Finance Committee Ranking Member Wyden, the senator from Oregon, and the former Senator Coates, then representing the state of Indiana. In addition to these high-profile plans that have been out there over the years, the Senate Finance Committee has also had countless tax reform hearings over this extended period. The committee has also held a series of bipartisan option papers, discussions under then-Chairman Baucus. Additionally, under Chairman Hatch, we had bipartisan tax reform groups. All of this work over the years has laid the foundation and informed the unified framework released by the so-called Big Six. That's the framework I previously referred to. The influence of these prior discussions and proposals on the Big Six framework is evident. In other words, all that work that has gone on over the years in different environs is bearing fruit now in getting a consensus of what we ought to do in a broad way of moving forward on tax simplification, tax reform, and tax cuts. The framework is nothing but a framework and will be filled in with details by the tax writing committee. And it's at that point that any think tank, any member of the other political party, any member of our political party, any college professors, any economists, any place can make some sound judgments, the extent to which certain people benefit or don't benefit from the legislation before us. But I think they ought to take into consideration, you got to think about the country as a whole that hasn't grown by more than 1 6/10% each of the 8 years of the previous administration. And if you're going to have jobs created, you got to grow at about twice that amount at 3% or more. And that's some of the thinking behind this budget that's before the Senate right now, and the thinking behind the tax reform measures that will follow our adoption of the budget. Now, I'll be repeating myself to some extent here, but for illustration, I have a chart here comparing the Big Six framework, the Wyden-Coates bill that I've already referred to, and the Simpson-Bowles plan that I've already referred to. And you can see here the main point of putting these three plans together is to show similarity. All proposals would consolidate the current tax brackets down to 3. That's one point the chart makes. 2 plans provide for a top rate of 35%, while one provides for a top rate of 28%. Yet, the Big Six framework, the framework that will evolve into a piece of legislation called tax simplification, tax reform, and tax cuts, is being criticized for having a 35% top rate as somehow a giveaway to wealthy. Whereas you can see from this chart that plans that have been bipartisan in the past have had the 35% top rate or less. And of course, the 35% tax rate that's said is a giveaway to the wealthy is not even the one that proposes a 28% yet lower rate. This is reserved, the 28% is reserved for the Simpson-Bowles plan, and that Simpson-Bowles group was put together by none other than a Democratic president. So let me ask, were Democratic members of the Simpson-Bowles Commission that voted for that plan voting to give huge tax cuts to the wealthy? Do our Democratic colleagues expect us to believe that a 35% top rate is a sensible bipartisan compromise when offered by Democrats, but a giveaway to the rich once it's associated with this administration or with Republican members of the Congress? Well, another thing that is the same in all three plans would repeal the alternative minimum tax. Well, this is very surprising. From listening to my Democrat colleagues, I thought repealing the alternative minimum tax was some nefarious plot to benefit President Trump. But that just doesn't square with the reality and what's going on in the Congress over the last decade and a half in regard to tax reform. Repealing the alternative minimum tax has long been has had strong bipartisan support. While serving as either chairman or ranking member of the Finance Committee, Senator Baucus and I introduced bipartisan, standalone legislation to repeal the alternative minimum tax, and we did that across several Congresses. Of course, we were not successful. I hope that this Congress will be successful in doing that. Our legislation eliminating the alternative minimum tax garnered bipartisan support from across the political spectrum. The current ranking member of the Finance Committee and the current minority leader of the entire United States Senate even joined Senator Baucus and me at that time in the efforts as co-sponsors of that legislation. At the time, a few years ago, the current ranking member even went so far as to say that, quote, the alternative minimum tax should be Congress's #1 priority for tax reform. I agree with what the current ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee said a few years ago that I just quoted. The alternative minimum tax repeal should be a top priority, and it seems like it is going to be a top priority this year, because the alternative minimum tax adds needless complexity to the tax code, often hits middle-income taxpayers rather than wealthy as originally intended. Let me give history of the alternative minimum tax. I think it was passed 1969 because studies of wealthy people showed about 150 people that were very wealthy paid no income tax. And there was a real feeling that everybody ought to pay some tax. So the alternative minimum tax was set up to hit those 150 and some other people. But it wasn't ever indexed, and now it hits just millions of middle-income taxpayers. That's why, to help those middle-income taxpayers that should have never been hit by the alternative minimum tax, is the rationale for doing away with it. And we even have the Internal Revenue Service taxpayer advocate repeatedly calling for the repeal of the alternative minimum tax, noting that it, quote, does not achieve its original goal and stealthily increases marginal rates for middle-income taxpayers, end of quote. Now I want to move on to the corporate tax part of the framework. Similarity between these plans exists. I'm back at the chart now. For reform of the corporate tax system. For instance, each one of these three plans seeks to significantly lower our corporate tax rate. The Wyden-Coates bill calls for an 11% reduction in the corporate rate, bringing that rate down from 35 to 24. The Big Six framework aims for a 20% hike, the highest corporate tax rate. Yet, according to the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, the corporate rate reduction in the Big Six framework is, quote, a massive corporate tax cut that overwhelmingly benefits shareholders, end of quote. Now, the last time I checked, the distribution of the benefit from a corporate rate reduction is the same no matter what party or what president proposed it. And this chart shows that similarity between Democrat and bipartisan plans and the Big Six framework. I don't think that Senate Finance Committee ranking member proposed a 24% corporate rate when that Wyden-Coates plan was developed, because he wanted to provide a massive benefit to shareholders that he now talks about. I also know for certain that isn't why the Big Six framework aims for 20%. The truth is, there has been a really big, growing bipartisan consensus that our corporate tax rate is out of step with other major trading partners. Now at 35%, and it's been at 35% for decades, our corporate tax rate is the highest among developed countries. While we have been at 35%, our major trading partners have been lowering their rates On average, their rates are more than 10% lower than ours, so averaging maybe about 24%. Now, that has obviously great impact on jobs in America because it puts American companies at a competitive disadvantage globally, costing American jobs. It has also strained our corporate tax system to its breaking point as we have battled corporate inversions and foreign takeovers. Now, how much in the last several years have we heard members of this body complaining about foreign takeovers and inversions to skip the corporate tax or to skip the country to save taxes? Well, that's one of the reasons for reducing the corporate tax rate so that doesn't happen. Moreover, a growing body of economic literature has shown that a significant portion of the corporate tax does indeed fall on workers in the form of lower wages. A nonpartisan joint committee on taxation, as well as the Congressional Budget Office, assumes 25% of corporate tax falls on workers. So you reduce the corporate tax rate, according to congressional researchers here that work for us, you would assume that workers are going to get 25% of that benefit to their wages. And we even have other studies. Many find workers could bear more than 70% of the burden of a high corporate tax rate. While the exact burden borne by workers may be debated, the economic research is very clear. A corporate rate reduction means a significant wage increase for workers. In fact, the Council of Economic Advisors very conservatively estimates workers could see their wages increase by more than $4,000 due to lowering the corporate rate to 20%. In reality, there's very little in this tax framework that has not had bipartisan support in the past or is not well within the mainstream of bipartisan proposals before us. Once again, that statement I just made is the purpose of this chart, to show that this bipartisan agreement, and what we have before the Congress coming up, the Big Six framework, have so many likenesses in it that there's absolutely no rationale for the partisanship that we're having in the news media and on the Senate floor talking about this framework. So this is why the accusations that the Big Six tax framework is nothing more than a giveaway to the rich, and why that statement that we hear so often is so dumbfounding. I want to move on to another issue about whether or not this is tax cuts for the rich. I want you to show one of the proposals before the Congress will help the rich. So more perplexing is that those that are screaming tax cuts for the rich and saying it the loudest have also been the most ardent supporters of maintaining one of the largest loopholes for the wealthy, namely the state and local tax deduction. I know that the minority leader was down here, I think last week, citing IRS statistics to claim that the deduction was really a middle-class benefit. But the minority leader told only part of that story. So I would like to look at some estimates by the Liberal Tax Policy Center, whom my Democratic colleagues like to cite so often. According to the Tax Policy Center, 90% of the tax increase from eliminating the deduction would fall on taxpayers with incomes exceeding $100,000, and 40% of the total would be paid just by taxpayers with incomes exceeding $500,000 a year. Think of it this way. Those with incomes exceeding $500,000 make up less than 1% of all tax filers, yet receive 40% of the deduction benefit of claiming state and local tax deduction. I'd like to illustrate it a better way. So I have a chart based on IRS data that looks at the benefit of the deduction by adjusted gross income. Prior to going to the chart, I think it is important to point out that only about 30% of the taxpayers even itemize and have the state and local tax deduction available to them, because you have to itemize to get that. This chart is going to focus on that 30%. The first group that I have highlighted on this chart are taxpayers with incomes below $50,000. Only about 12%, as you can see here, only about 12% of the tax filers in this group claim the deduction. In other words, 88% of the taxpayers in this category receive no benefit from the state and local tax deduction. Now, that 12% does get a fairly nice benefit from it. They're deducting an average of a little over $3,000 in state taxes for a state benefit of just under $500, assuming they are in today's 15% bracket. From further down the chart, you'll see that the benefit afforded low to middle income taxpayers are very much dwarfed by the benefits afforded to the wealthy, or as some of my Democrat colleagues might have come accustomed to referring to them as the millionaires and billionaires, where only 12% of the taxpayers with incomes under $50,000 have any benefit of the state and local tax deduction. Over 90% of the filers with incomes exceeding $500,000 claim the deduction. Tax filers in the $500,000 to $1 million range are on the average deducting more in state and local taxes, $53,000, than the incomes of the taxpayers in the first group. If we assume taxpayers in this second group are under the current law at 39.6% tax bracket, that translates into a tax benefit of nearly $21,000. For those with incomes exceeding $1 million, there's about an average tax benefit of about $100,000. So if you're truly interested in eliminating tax loopholes for the rich, look no further than the elimination of the state and local tax deduction. Its elimination provides an opportunity to better target more tax relief where we want to target, to the middle class, making up for any benefit the middle class may lose from deductions and then some. In other words, the income tax would remain much more progressive. The Big Six framework provides the tools to do a middle income tax reduction, including nearly doubling the standard deduction, reducing the current 15% rate to 12%, and significantly increasing the child tax credit. The framework also grants significant leeway to the Finance and the Ways and Means Committee to explore additional options to ensuring middle-income tax relief. In addition to being a benefit that overwhelmingly goes to the wealthy, the state and local tax deduction also has the effect of disproportionately benefiting states with high tax or high state and local taxes. Essentially, the deduction allows wealthy individuals in high tax states to then offload some of their state and local tax burdens onto taxpayers in the other states. So here I have another chart, a chart that lists the top 10 states that benefit the most from the state and local tax deduction. The states there, as you can see, and the extent to which they benefit from it. You see we have New York way at the top. A little lower is California. A little bit below that is Massachusetts. It would seem to me that our Democratic colleagues like to talk a big game about eliminating loopholes for the wealthy, but when it comes down to actually doing it, they're more interested in holding on to a tax subsidy that favors the tax and spend policies of overwhelmingly blue states. I yield the floor.